So what's up, Matt? Like, we're just hanging out at my house right now, and you're here.
Yeah,
Salt Lake City, which is kind of rare.
Thanks for inviting me to hang out and chat in an official way, not just our usual BS way, with no one listening.
Oh, our usual BS with people like at live shows?
No, just talking by ourselves, like over lunch and such.
Oh, yeah.
Saying all kinds of nonsense.
Yeah, I guess that we do that a lot,
Yeah.
and when we're driving in cars and stuff. So yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, the Monday morning data chat came about because Matt and I we'd often go on long walks or just hang out and we'd talk about data stuff for hours and hours and hours. And I guess we decided to make it a podcast, and here we are doing a podcast.
Yeah, and there's like never a dull moment in data, right?
There isn't?
So, meaning, yeah, it's kind of boring in some ways, right? All this technology, obsessing over corporate data and such, but there's always some new technology fad happening, I would say, for at least the last 2 decades. Is that your perception? I mean, since you got into the industry, was there a new fad every time you turned around?
That's an interesting question. I would say it's probably gotten more amplified as data's become cool. The fads back in the day, I think, were mainly I suppose I need to back up and say, okay, so like what was a kind of a VC funded securitized fad versus a fad that actually delivered business results. So the fads back in the day, we're talking 2000s, late 90s, whatever, it was like data management type of stuff was cool. But the tools were super crude. But I don't think you had like the amount of VC funding that you have now, and you didn't have the data science hype bubble. So I think that's what's way different about now versus back then. Now it feels like a lot of the tools and a lot of the chatters, obviously about tools, and there's a lot of reasons we can get into for that. But it feels like it's definitely a different world these days.
Yeah. The ads are very financially driven, and I think there are a lot of complaints, some of them legitimate, about content that's designed just to drive investments of various sorts, right? Like, okay, I've invested in this company, I now need to fund a bunch of content behind the scenes to drive that as a proper fad, so people get excited about this thing that's happening in the next.
Give me an example, Matt.
Well, I mean, I think the first place I saw it in the industry, I think it goes back further with data science, but it was the whole, so you had the GFS paper landed, so MapReduce, Google File Store, right? The famous, well, you had 2 separate papers that talked about the MapReduce process at Google, and then the Google File System, which I think that one actually came first, how you distribute data across a huge cluster. And then at Yahoo, they started the Hadoop project to develop an open source version of this. And then over time, you had a couple of companies that were built around this.
Yeah.
And that was the first big financial hype cycle that I saw, like Cloudera, Hortonworks, MapR. All these companies are so exciting because they're building on this technology and this is the future.
Yeah.
And then suddenly that became uncool and we shifted toward cloud data systems. I mean, what fads did you see in the investment space?
Same kind of stuff. I'd say the data science hype cycle brought in. I mean, I'm kind of harkening back to Matt Turk's 2012 data landscape.
Yeah.
Which is, we're recording this on a Tuesday, April 12th, or 2nd, sorry. Look at my collection.
Joe can also time travel.
I can time travel.
About what day.
Too, and
he was just on April 12th, yeah.
So April 2nd, we'll be actually chatting with Matt Turk about his latest data landscape pretty soon. And I started to read his report, and it's interesting just because I think there were like 100, maybe under 140 companies on that original slide, and now he's like 2,100 companies or something like that. So it's a lot, right? It's a lot of companies. But the interesting thing is, okay, so data is cooler, but I would say the fads really were definitely around. So if you look at the 2012 kind of talking about, right? So it was all big data tooling. Most of those companies aren't around anymore. I think Cloudera might be one of the only ones that's still, in existence. And, with the other companies, I mean, they got absorbed, went out of business, or, something else happened. I mean, the fads back then, it was definitely big data. Data science was all about, leveraging stuff in Python, I guess, right? Or Scala to a far lesser extent. I think that kind of lost out. But you fast forward to today, and I think a lot of those things are being solidified now, right? So the data frame paradigm definitely caught on. I think that's like the big one where I don't see a lot of people talking about that, but I feel like data frames in particular were one of the big kind of secular trends that sort of got us out of this database centric world of how to analyze data. So I think that was one of the big ones. I mean, data frames aren't new. They came out in I think 1990 even.
Yeah, and you can argue that Excel is basically a data frame, although you don't have static typing there, which you can in data frames.
Yeah.
But just that like paradigm, we have a bunch of data, but it also is put in a particular order. That's very appealing to doing analytics in like a desktop environment, but it turns out you can now scale it up. Like this is a core paradigm of Spark, and Polaris and a bunch of other systems are all built around this idea.
Yeah. So if you were, we should do a separate episode on data frames.
Yeah.
It's super fun to talk about. But no, I mean, but when I kind of zoom out, I think that was one of the major things that made data really easy to work with, right? And I recall the conversations back in the 2010s, especially the early 2010s, was, well, you won't need data warehouses anymore. SQL is going to go away because we have MapReduce, we have data frames, and like, what's the point of all this, legacy stuff? And of course, that prediction never panned out. SQL's still here, despite attempts, I think, to sort of, do away with SQL. Everyone wants to come up with a better SQL, and everyone wants to come up with a better way of, doing Excel or getting rid of Excel. But none of those things have happened. So, but yeah, if I were to point to the fad, or I guess the trend that kind of underpinned a lot of stuff, it was the data frame.
Yeah, that's a big one. And on the other hand, in the more traditional database side of things, you have the data lakehouse that's emerged in the last couple of years. And yes, it is a vendor term, but I think there's actually a reality behind it. And the fact is, it kind of reflects a reality that emerged in practical settings even back in like 2015, 16, something like this, which is, storing a bunch of data in a place like S3 or Hadoop back then, but still putting a schema on it and querying it with SQL and really treating it like you would a traditional data warehouse system.
Oh yeah, well, data lakes were all the rage. I guess that was the other fad. That fad in the truest sense, where I think people did it and then they realized it had a lot of shortcomings.
Yeah.
But the underlying stuff, it's there. I mean, the fact that you can separate compute from storage and take advantage of really cheap, ubiquitous, infinitely scalable storage is the other attribute that I think was introduced and hasn't gone away. We were just literally speaking with a client about that the other day, about how open table formats are something they should probably adopt, so they're not beholden to the storage pricing and whims of a particular vendor. So I think all that stuff is here, and that's pretty awesome to see.
Yeah, it's nice to have the multi-paradigm approach really getting legs. And we kind of had that in the Hadoop era, but there were always questions about what your storage format was going to be, how you were going to track changes, how you were going to do things like transactions. I don't mean a transaction in a single row sense, but like, I'm going to do a huge change to this data, and I want to keep the old version and the new version, and I want to keep some level of consistency and be able to go back in time. And we've solved those problems, basically. And I'm kind of surprised at the speed with which Iceberg has emerged as the winner, because I think I started hearing a lot about Iceberg maybe in 2021. Does that sound right? I think it goes back further than that, but it was really getting legs at that point.
It was getting crowded out too. I think there was so much. I mean, 2021 in particular was I think was sort of peak noise for the data tooling space, because it seemed like everybody had a data tooling company. I think you and I were sitting there like, should we just start one too, so we can be like all of our other friends that have data tooling companies?
Just claim that it does something to do with the modern data stack.
I'm glad we didn't take that route, by the way. That would have been I think
we'd be retired in the Bahamas with our ill-gotten gains. It'd be terrible.
You retired, or conversely, like stressing out over like having a tool in a very crowded space and trying to make a market out of that, which I think is reality for a lot of these companies right now. It's I mean, so I think, Iceberg was one of those things where it was definitely there for a while, but, that was there along with everything else. So, but the advantage of that, I feel like it sort of takes a bit of a different, it's maybe a different song, so to speak, than the modern data stack, which was, I think there to solve like truly classical analytical problems, but in the cloud, right? So that was sort of what it's always been about. And again, these problems are the ones that I grew up in and were there way before too. The same problem, data warehousing, and the things that attempted to solve really were, that's all the modern data stack sort of extended into.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, there are two big drivers, well, maybe three big drivers for the modern data stack trend. So one was Snowflake had been big for a couple of years, but for various reasons, like 2020, everyone was very interested in Snowflake. It's like, okay, if I have Snowflake, what am I going to do to replace all these traditional data tools like in Informatica? And so the modern data stack was all about these different pieces of Informatica that kind of need to surround Snowflake to make it really useful. I think the second thing was, so going back to Snowflake, the Snowflake IPO, and that bubble just was, well, I won't say bubble. I think Snowflake has really good prospects long term, but that IPO popped so nicely, like the valuation shot up so quickly that every venture capitalist wanted to figure out how to get a piece of that action. What are you going to do? Well, build something that's Snowflake adjacent. Hence, find anyone who will found a data tooling company that's connected somehow with Snowflake or related data warehouse tools. And the third one I see is just like, I don't know, I feel like COVID kind of drove this as well. Like all of us data people were bored and looking for things to talk about, and Snowflake was there and these tools were there, and that got dubbed the modern data stack, and we spent a lot of years obsessing over that.
Yeah, I mean, I could say COVID was definitely a way that a lot of people came together. I remember, during the height of COVID, just being on random Zoom calls with data practitioners that are like locally optimistic or similar types of groups. Yep. And a lot of these people are still friends, so I think that's cool. I think it definitely, if COVID did anything, it definitely, it did a lot of things. But for the data world, it obviously introduced a lot of funding, but I think it also, changed the scope of how people communicate and the communities that we have. Like a couple of weeks ago, I was hanging out with Demetrios Brinkman in Paris. We were just riding bikes around, and he started the MLOps community during the pandemic. I think he maybe got laid off from his job or something, and then he started this group, and it killed. And it's still here and doing exceedingly well. And I would never have met Demetrios if it weren't for the pandemic. I guess it would have been really hard.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it seems like I'd love to get more concrete statistics on this and almost like a sociological study, but it seems like the pandemic fundamentally changed the nature of professional social media interactions. I mean, LinkedIn had been emerging as a social network for years by then, but that's what really pushed it over the edge. And then when COVID ended, we actually started making these virtual relationships like concrete in-person relationships. And that's been a very cool thing to see. Like, it's not just like Facebook where you have all these friends whom you'll never meet. A lot of your friends you'll actually meet and hang out with and discuss and continue the discussions that you've had online.
Yeah, LinkedIn became cool.
I don't know if I'd say cool. That might be.
Well, I mean, I mean, I got rid of a lot of social media. LinkedIn's the only one I'm on, except for, very, very lightly Instagram and then Threads. But that's more. There's no rhyme or reason to that. It's not like I'm intentional about using those. But LinkedIn, I'm not even intentional about using that. To be fair.
Yeah.
Right, but yeah, it's interesting. I travel around the world and meet people that are current like LinkedIn friends and stuff. I think it's pretty awesome to see just how the community evolves. But
I want to go back to Demetrios, though. I think that he totally hit the jackpot on his timing because he started this during COVID. That helped to ramp it up. And then we went right into the Gen AI craze. And frankly, I would say, I've been arguing for a while, that Gen AI model training needs more data engineering practices and frankly needs more apps practices like ML.
Well, it needs a lot. And we have a lot of friends in the ML space. I mean, I think we definitely sit adjacent to it. I know for me, it's an area where I'll be spending a lot more time, but it's kind of where I came from actually. So, but yeah, it's definitely one of those things. Well, I'll give you an interesting anecdote, right? So I was doing it was in November. I was in San Jose doing a meetup with the MLOps community there, and what I found really interesting was in the Bay Area, there was like 16 other meetups at night. Mm-hmm. And the big ones are like all the AI ones, all the generative AI ones. So a lot of these are promoted by VC firms trying to probably show off their companies to get more deal flow or
find new founders.
Track new companies. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. So that's sort of the intention of that. But it's funny because MLOps was sort of the the old timers club. Sort of like the VA or something like that, or the VFW. So I thought that was kind of interesting. We still got a good turnout, but when you're competing against 16 other events, some of which are having like hundreds of people show up. I mean, you could basically go to meetups every night in San Francisco and get really good food. Get
you
free
never feed
drinks.
yourself. Yep.
Yeah, I'm sure people do this. But it was interesting because I felt like, okay, so it's kind of a sign of the times where people are focused on, the sizzling hot stuff, the generative AI stuff. But you're absolutely right. The foundational things, you're going to come back to it. I mean, I was just talking to my friend Will last week, who is a co-founder over at Coactive. They do really cool stuff with unstructured data, and he in his own right, and him and his founder, just they're legends in the machine learning space. But he was lamenting that basically, everyone's focused on the cool stuff, but it's building all the systems underneath it that that's what's going to make these companies work. The infrastructure, the architecture, and the practices around data. Really, it's like right now everyone just hoovers in as much data as possible.
Yes.
So I sort of made the comment, is this kind of like data lake like 2.0, where now it's just like instead of just storing data into S3, now you just store it all into a large language model and hope the best, right? But I think through a lot of reasons, I don't think that that's sustainable.
Well, we're seeing that there are a lot of open legal questions, these lawsuits from the New York Times and from various authors whose materials were used to train ChatGPT, GPT underneath. What's going to happen with those lawsuits? So is it going to be illegal or not just to hoover up copyrighted material and use it to train a large language model, even if it doesn't regurgitate directly that material? We don't know. We don't know the answer to that legal question right now. And anyone in the space really needs to protect against that risk. And that means doing something very basic in data engineering, and that is controlling what data goes into your model.
Do you, though? I mean, because I would make an argument that because there's no law against it, you can treat it like the Wild West. And if you had that mentality, like, why not? What's to stop you?
Well, it's going to be really interesting. I mean, I think one thing we can point back to, which you're probably pretty familiar with, is the sampling wars.
Yeah.
Right? So a lot of musicians took this approach like, okay, I'm just going to sample whatever I want and we'll see what happens legally. Mm-hmm. I think one of the most famous cases is, what's the name of the band? The Verve? And they had this really famous song, Bittersweet Symphony, and they sampled the Rolling Stones for their like main riff for the whole song. And they basically lost all their rights to that song, which was their like one huge hit, and the band broke up, and that was the end of the story. And I think as a startup right now, you have to worry about the same thing. Maybe you are super successful. Maybe you do become a superstar, but one lawsuit could wipe you out because you just don't know what the legal consequences of your training data are going to be. I think the assumption right now is this space is going to be so big that you're going to be able to pay whatever legal costs you have to.
Well, even some of the big technology providers, if you're doing a generative AI on their platforms, they've already said they're going to pitch in for your lawsuit if not cover it entirely.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm very curious to see where it goes. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I could definitely see two paths. One's like, screw it. I mean, let's get as much as we can now, and if we get sued, then I guess we'll deal with it when we deal with it. Make as much money as you can now, and deal with this lawsuit later. I mean, that's a classical approach for a lot of companies in America, whether you're talking tech or oil or railroads or anything else. It's if there's a lot of money to be made and there's no laws against it, then see what you can do.
Well, and the
other thing is buy off all the politicians and
there you go.
and shape the laws. This is how it's been done in the past.
Yep. But I mean, you have several other risks on inputs too, right? You have hate speech and all kinds of stuff that you don't want coming out of your model, so you want to be careful about how you ingest that data. And you have private data, and that's a big one. That's clearly violating things like GDPR if your model memorizes private data and then someone could figure out how to extract it. You have another potential lawsuit or just government sanctions waiting for you. And I think the other thing to think about is if I'm training a model today and I'm a startup, the cost to train that model from scratch is just enormous. It's obscene. And if in the future the laws change, or at least the laws get clarified, and I know, okay, it's not okay to ingest private data and hate speech and copyrighted material, is that going to force me to retrain from scratch? And the potential cost of that is enormous. And so am I trying to protect myself against that future risk by being careful about what I ingest? I kind of feel like it's going to be impossible to filter out all data that I don't want to ingest. That's going to be really tough, but at least reducing the risk.
But the EU AI Act, for example, right, it's going to kind of force the issue, because I think that this is basically the equivalent of GDPR, but for AI. So, but I'm very curious to see how the EU ends up enforcing it. I have a pretty good idea, but I'm not going to say. I mean, it needs to fund itself somehow.
Yep.
So,
yep.
you know,
We'll see. Yeah, it's going to be very interesting because I think most American companies, with GDPR, it was interesting because you saw this and I saw this working at companies at the time. In many cases, companies had no data engineering practice for that particular problem, and so they simply deleted all private data, or almost all data they ingested after a period of time, like 6 months, the required period of time, the required window by GDPR, rather than trying to do filtering at the individual level. And then what happened is over time, some companies just simply decided not to do business in the EU, especially small startups with limited resources. And so we're going to see similar things in this case where some companies will just decide that it's not tenable to do business in the EU, at least for a period of time while they resolve some of these issues.
Yeah, I think the other companies just fly under the radar and hope they don't get caught.
Yep.
You know, you have to be. I think you get on the radar by either being big, where they they can get a lot of money out of you, or you do something so egregiously stupid that you should get caught.
They swoop in and shut you down, basically.
Yeah. You kind of you did something that was just like so publicly bad. Like you kind of deserve it. But I mean, given the number of companies in the world, right? Like it's you got to look at the risk profile too, as our lawyers always fond of saying. Like what's the risk? If you're a small company, what's the risk that anyone's actually going to come after you at all? As my old boss would say too, like I want you to I want you to steal my intellectual property, right? So when you get bigger, I can sue you. This was a very intentional thing that he would say. But
that's the patent troll strategy, right?
Yeah.
Like get rights to these patents that seem obscure and then wait until there's an opportunity and then
he's
pounce.
going to let you grow. He's just going to wait. He's got all the time in the world for you. He's not going to stomp you out when you're small. He wants you to succeed, right? But that was I think an example of somebody who would definitely use the legal system for different reasons. So I can't say I agree with it, but it is what it is.
Oh, I mean, it's a strategy that exists, and
a lot of companies do it.
Yep, absolutely, and nothing is going to make it go away in the near future.
Oh no, I think it's almost like it's designed to help with this.
One thing I'm curious about with respect to the EU AI Act is how the success of certain AI companies in Europe is going to affect the thinking on this. Because I think the attitude with GDPR is that we're fighting the big bad American companies for the most part, right? We're fighting the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons of the world and with this legislation, and we're going to make them pay or at least clean up their act. And I feel like with the success of a company like Mistral in the AI space, that's going to kind of make at least France rethink this a bit and say, wait, hold on. Maybe, here's our opportunity to have our own Silicon Valley. Do we really want to screw that up? Let's at least try to be gentle about this so that our companies can succeed against the open AIs and the Silicon Valley-based
It was a curious
companies.
thing, right? I mean, I thought about that a lot. I mean, I go to Paris quite a bit now. I kind of consider it an adopted home. And it feels like there's a lot of stuff happening in Paris right now with tech and AI. There's good entrepreneurial energy there, which is interesting because in Europe in general, it definitely feels very backwards. If you're coming from America, an American business climate, just because for a lot of reasons, right? The tendency is to be risk averse. Failure is a bad thing. On the flip side, as an employer, you can't fire people. It's like really, really hard to get rid of employees, so it makes you less likely to want to either hire, and then so it's an interesting environment. I think that they'll have their own version of tech success. I don't think that it would ever resemble Silicon Valley. I don't know what a place that does replicate it. Bangalore is probably the place where I would think that it might have a chance.
That could
or
be
some
interesting.
Cities in China, really, but they sort of have a different thing. I'm on some group chats with people in a lot of data and technology people in Bangalore, and I think there it feels like the entrepreneurial energy is finally there, where they're not just thinking, let's just be the sort of the sweatshop of American companies, but they really the conversation is that why don't we just try and build this on our own. So I think that's pretty cool, but there it's I think there's a lot more of a capitalistic sort of sense, and even in China, I feel like it's probably got more going for it in that way than Europe does. Just because there's a lot of baggage, and I think it's. But then again, I know a lot of people. I don't know if I say a lot of people, but I definitely have a lot of friends who are founders in France who I deeply respect, and they see I think they're going to do really well. So,
I mean, what I would say broadly is that America would do well not to be too complacent about their position in the business hierarchy. Because, recall that before World War II, like Berlin and Prussia and Germany were kind of the Silicon Valley of the world at that time. That was the center of world innovation. Like, yeah, a lot of cool stuff was happening in the U.S.
They had lots of cool helmets there.
What's that? Less cool helmets.
This Ottoman soldiers and stuff, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, point is, like, you can lose your seat at the top of the pyramid pretty quickly. Like, India or China or even Europe at some point may take our top spot. That's quite possible. It's funny too, because the literal Silicon Valley of the world these days is not in the U.S. It's Taiwan, right? TSMC, like the leading producer of semiconductors. Like that's where NVIDIA GPUs are made. So maybe it will be Taiwan or something like this. I don't know.
We'll see. I think they got a few problems going on.
Yeah.
So more power to them. I like Taiwan a lot. It's a great place. Yeah. So, but I think that company started. The Wall Street Journal ran an article over the
Morris
weekend.
Chang. Yeah.
55 years old, starts the world's most important company, which could argue it is. I mean, it's so important that I think we're willing to fight a war over it. So
go, and I think I recommended already to you Chip War, which is about the whole history. It's a really good book, and they talk a lot about the story of Morris Chang and how basically he was of Chinese descent, and he spent his very early years in mainland China and fled basically the regime at the time. But he didn't go to Taiwan because of like some kind of loyalty or something. He went to Taiwan because his ideas were ignored by Texas Instruments and other American companies, right? So that's what we have to watch out for. Like, our complacency can get us into a lot of trouble.
Mm-hmm. No, it wouldn't be the first time, but there's the cool thing, I think about doing business in America is it's very easy to start companies. Taxes are relatively low. If you're an employer, for better or for worse, labor laws are, they're very favorable to employers. I think they should be more favorable to employees, in certain circumstances. But it is what it is. But the business environment here is really good, right? I mean, we're in Utah right now, which I think usually ranks among the top places in the United States to do business for a lot of reasons.
Even California, everyone whines about California. Understandably, California has its problems. The Economist just ran an article about economic problems in California. But look at how big the economy of California is. It's just absolutely massive. Mm-hmm. And it remains the center of innovation. And so, like, if they can continue to capitalize on that, then they can keep their top spot.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even here, you have things like Silicon Slopes.
Yep.
Which I think are, kind of localized attempts. And you see this around the country too, like Silicon Prairie, I think in, Kansas, and, a bunch of other, Silicon Beach, and I don't know what Miami's called, but kind of same thing. But, it won't, I mean, I know for at least speaking of Silicon Slopes, it's like, I think it's a very Utah-centric type of companies come out of here.
Yeah.
Right? They're focused on like lead generation and sales and marketing and things related to that, because it's just kind of culture you have here. It's very sales oriented, right? So,
well, the problem too is that at least the way I understand the history, Silicon Slopes really came out of Omniture. So Omniture was this company that did like web tracking, basically, customer journey tracking and such. And Omniture got purchased by Adobe. Adobe built a big headquarters here and extended their operations beyond what they had acquired from Omniture. And then the next big thing was like Domo. And Domo was supposed to put us on the map because we had like Jeff Bezos and all these outside investors. And unfortunately, like on the stock market, they have not performed that well.
Yeah,
yeah, that's a whole discussion anyway.
It's a whole different discussion. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think seeing a lot of the push to put Utah on the map, for example. We're just using this as an example because we both happen to be here right now. Matt, you don't even live here anymore.
Right.
You live in Silicon Alley, I think is what they call New York, right? So, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and some great companies come out of here. But at the same time, I don't know. Like, personally, my mind, like, Utah is like literally the last place in my mind. I happen to live here, but like, I just operating, I don't know, much more like a global sense at this point. So if people ask me about Utah companies, I'm probably the last guy to ask at this point.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, I mean, in some sense, it's like build where you see the opportunities. If it happens to be in Silicon Valley, then work there. If you happen to see a big opportunity in another place where you're living and you have a good network, then build there.
Well, that's the beauty of today. You can start companies, and I think have good opportunities to kind of no matter where you are. I think it really just comes down to your ability to be an effective entrepreneur and business person at the end of the day, and take advantage of the, I guess do the best of the tools you have, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, there's been a lot of great companies that weren't built, in the Bay Area or New York. I mean, so it's just how it is, and they'll continue to be the case. But at the same time, the Bay Area has a lot of advantages. You go there and everyone's there.
That's right. And in a world of social media where we talk so much about engagement with humans online through platforms like LinkedIn, through messaging, through Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, all these modalities, it turns out that FaceTime and seeing someone physically at a meetup still has a lot of value. At least we can argue that, given the number of startups, just the sheer fertility of that area for producing new companies that do well.
But again, why is it that somebody like Demetrios, who lives in a village outside of Frankfurt, can be a steward of a large global community, right? It's because, just at the end of the day, he's highly effective at what he does, and it's awesome to see, and so I think that, why is it that, why is it when we sort of, I guess got more popular, we're just two dorks out of Salt Lake City, I mean, that shouldn't have happened if geography was the only constraint.
Yeah, I mean, there's this tension between globalization of tech, which I think, in spite of the arguments to the contrary, seems to be alive and well, and then concentrations of tech and business in places like San Francisco and New York.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, in New York, it's this huge city, and it's arguably one of the capitals of the world. Just people come there from all over the place, and yet New York can feel very provincial, and it can feel like a little village sometimes.
Oh, we're talking about that. Yeah. It's like you feel like you're in your own little town, and then you got your little social group.
Well, these are the blocks we care about. It's really just a few miles, and here are the sites that we care about, and it's actually geographically not that much, even though there's a lot going on in those areas. And very much the Bay Area is the same thing, right? Huge number of people, massive amounts of money, these huge companies operating, and yet it feels very village-like and small at the same time. And so I think that's what something like the ML Ops community does. It takes you out of that village to say, we're global now. Let's connect people from Silicon Valley with New York, with Bangalore.
Well, even in New York, though, every time I'm there, if I go to Ethan's happy hour or what's Data Driven NYC been like lately? Has it been more people there?
It's gotten really big.
That's cool.
Recently, they've been hosting it at Moody's Analytics. They've been generous enough, as far as I know, to provide the space. And you have a lot of people there and just a lot of connections happening. And every time I go, I'm a pretty shy person, but I'll sit next to someone and have a really interesting conversation. And
how do you initiate the conversation, or does a person initiate it?
I usually initiate it. I'm kind of a social paradox. Once I warm up to people, I can talk. I just I'm a little bit. Sometimes
you're extroverted. You stare at their shoes and not yours.
Right. That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, New York's an interesting place, because it feels like, the data community there, it's big, but it's small.
Yeah.
It feels like, even when I go there, I feel like I know quite a few of the people there.
Yeah. The movers and shakers, yeah.
Yeah. And so, but that, that's cool to have. And then you got Chris Tabb. He's your new neighbor, so to speak.
That's right.
So.
Yeah, he lives in New Jersey, so we don't really claim him, but I hear that he's planning to move to New York at some point.
Okay, cool. So, we were hanging out a couple months ago over in Brooklyn, having some coffee. He took the train over. Said, call me over. It's funny. Yeah, you got a bunch of dorks like that, but I don't know. I'm just here all alone now because you moved, so...
You have the airport. That's your connection to the world and your internet connection.
It truly is.
Yeah.
It truly is.
Yeah.
Well, awesome, man. Well, fun chatting. We'll, I guess, pick things up on our morning data chat on Monday. So.
Yeah. I've been having a lot of fun on the show lately. We've had just fantastic guests. If you're listening, go check out last Monday's episode where we talked about things like control charts and manufacturing and how they apply.
Which don't sound sexy at all. It sounds like the most boring ass topic in the world.
But it's actually super cool. So yeah.
Well, I think it's because Cedric and Sam, they did a really good job at kind of I don't know, giving it some relevancy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like, it's like talking about I don't know, just ancient things. Like it's almost a steampunk episode in some ways, you know. But highly relevant, I would say. If you're in the data world, it was a good chat. You know, and yeah, Cedric's doing some cool stuff. I think Matt and I, when I was looking at the YouTube video last night, and I was like, from appearances, it's basically Cedric and Sam just look just like Matt and me, like two Asian guys, two bearded guys with glasses. It's like, this is hilarious, actually. So I showed it to some friends. They're like, oh yeah,
mirror images,
pretty funny.
Yeah,
it was pretty funny. I sent it to Cedric, and I'm like, yeah. This we're going to do more stuff. So
I was noticing how impressive his headphones were. He had like incredibly cool headphones.
Those are cool headphones.
Totally like DJ headphones or something.
Yeah,
like this. So,
yeah. So the audience, go check out that episode. I think it was good. Like it was good. I think it kind of shows like, you know, the type of conversations we like to have. Like Cedric, you know, has been writing Common Cog, his blog, for years, and I'd read it and always felt like he was one of the best writers I'd seen on the internet. I put him up there with Ben Thompson from Stratechery. Yeah. So, you know, to have people like that on the show now, I think it's pretty cool. It wasn't always that way, because it used to just be you and me.
Yeah, pretty much. And people kept listening. I don't know what they were thinking, but it was awfully nice of them.
Yeah, well, it's a charity thing. And maybe people were just that bored, where they're just like, these guys are my only lifeline, which is pretty sad. But I guess we're glad to be of service. So anyway, Matt, well, good to see you in Salt Lake again. I know you got to take off, but yeah. You got any? Oh, by the way, before I finish, are you working on anything cool? You got anything fun to talk about? Or
I'll just talk about one thing. I'm going to be at Data Universe next week. I'll be moderating a panel there, and we'll be broadly, you can go look up the title, but we're going to be talking about things like how data engineers should think about training models, and how people working on Gen AI should think about data engineering. And I think there are a lot of interesting questions in that space.
There are a lot of interesting questions,
as we talked about earlier. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it feels like that space too. It's still evolving. Yeah. I'm curious. My curiosity is more about, do data engineers become ML engineers and vice versa?
Yeah.
I kind of think that there's an argument for this. I mean, as we wrote about in the last chapter of our book, you know, I think this is the inevitability as things overlap.
I mean, okay, so here's my hot take on that, just as I think about this. I don't think it's going to be a direct evolution, but I think the boundaries between these different disciplines are going to shift, right? Like we saw this with, it used to be called big data engineering, and then some people kept doing that to maintain old Hadoop stacks, and a lot of people evolved into like more cloud data engineers. That's kind of what happened to us.
Well, I think the big determinant of that is also like what title is going to make you the most money.
That's
and what
an
title
interesting one.
Can employers like attract, right? So then they attract people because his title is popular, therefore more people want to get that title so they can go other places and make good money. I mean, that's what happened with data engineering. That's what happened with data science, and that's what's going to keep happening with titles, because that's what they do. You know, a title, for better or for worse, does signal certain things, like how awesome of a person you are and how much money you should make.
Well, and what's funny is we've spent several years defining what a data engineer is and what data engineering even is, right? Even though arguably the discipline has been around since the 80s, we've been arguing over this.
Probably earlier. Yeah.
And then now we have a new title of like AI engineer. Now they're going to spend several years arguing over what that is. People will be doing the job, other people will be arguing over this, and then a new title will come along, and that title won't be cool anymore.
I mean, I gave a talk in France a week and a half ago about sort of the history of data science, you know, and starting from the beginnings, which is where DJ Patil and Jeff Hammerbacher came up with the name data scientist. And it was, I think DJ Patil said it was just so they could get HR off their back.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, there was never an intention of defining what data scientist meant. It left very ambiguous. And the only thing they were trying to do was hire people to LinkedIn and Facebook, right, who had the skills of like applying, basically problem solving on large sets of data.
And people who were working probably in science before that and had broad statistical and data skills that they could apply to other types of data, right?
Well, you saw this early on. I mean, a bunch of dorks like you would get hired because it's like, oh, he's got a math PhD. He's obviously be good at working with at a company in data, even though he's a theoretical academic. It shouldn't be anywhere close to a business. I'm joking, but no, I mean that was a bet back then, right? Everyone was like, well, because they took that strategy from hedge funds and quant funds that would just hire physicists and math PhDs, and
When
engineers.
I finished my bachelor's degree in physics in 2001, and at the time that was the hot thing to do if you weren't going into actual physics engineering applications, was to go work for a hedge fund.
Oh yeah. Still is if you want to do that. But then tech took all the jobs, but now everyone's all laid off now, so they're probably going back to hedge funds. So.
Probably, yeah. Well, I guess we could talk for a long time about the weirdness of the stock market, but that's another. We should probably close it out before we.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anyway, good to see you. Chat later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yep.